Merry Christmas, beer lovers, and today we're doing something incredibly special. We are making a Viking pine tree beer for Christmas. We're going old school, we've got the log luge going, so embrace your inner Viking because tonight we drink in Valhalla. Okay, first thing we need to do to make this Viking Christmas tree beer is choose our grain. And fortunately for us, the grain selection is simple because back in the day, when these beers were first being brewed, just like any regional area in, pre-medieval kind of era, you only really have one choice. It's not like you've got a whole bunch of specialty grains like chocolate malts and redbacks and whatever floating around. You're just gonna have barley. Basic 2-row barley. So in this case, I'm gonna be using Pilsner malt, which is kind of on theme with the style, and I've got a lot of it. So that's what we're running with. 14 kilos of the stuff to be exact, which I think is around 30 pounds or thereabouts. There'll be annotations for all this stuff in freedom units. Let's start crushing. All right, now that our grains are crushed, let's go chop down our tree. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is take off all the, I don't know if you call it spruce with a pine tree. I've come to learn a lot about spruce versus pine trees, and as it turns out, spruce and pine tree are not the same thing, which I always just assumed they were because I'm from Australia and this just isn't a thing here. But pine trees are a different family, and traditionally with these Norwegian old farmhouse beers, they were using spruce, which is like the branches of a juniper tree. I don't have access to that, but I have to imagine pine trees were also in rotation at some point or another, so it's kind of still historically accurate, or as accurate as I can get at least, and that's the whole goal with today's video. So what I'm going to do first is take off all the pine needles so that we're left with just the trunk, and once we've got just the trunk, I'm going to try and cut like a channel through the trunk because the goal is to run the hot wort through the trunk while we're mashing, and then to use all the pine needles, well, a bunch of pine needles, both in the mash and then also at the end of the boil. So let's chop it up. Expelliarmus! You're a wizard, Harry. All right.
Bust it off. All the gunk on it.
Yeah, that's just flavor.
Yeah, add that in.
Well, there we go. We got a channel. I need to trim out that little bit there, but the idea is I am going to pop the hot wort, prop this into the mash tun like that. The hot wort's going to flow from the top and make a luge back into the mash tun. So I might deepen this a little bit.
Turn it around a bit.
And then see how much further up the trunk I can get because it's quite a thin trunk. But it is working. Chainsaw for the win. I was thinking about using a circular saw for this and that was just stupid. Okay, now we still want to use all the pine needles because this is where a bunch of the resin and that pine forward flavor and aroma comes from. I know that this is very overpowering stuff though. It's kind of hard to get an actual answer about how much you should use like per liter or per gallon. What I've decided to do is start kind of on the medium to low side because I can always add more later because I'm going to do half in the mash and then the other half late stage boil. So after tasting the wort at the start of the mash, at the end of the mash, then I can kind of decide if we've got enough pine needle flavor in there. So I'm going to go with 250 grams of pine for the mashing stage. So let's just weigh it out and see how much we have to work with. We have plenty to work with. I guess I should really be trying to use like the greenest, prettiest ones. How much is that? It's about...
See what it tastes like. You're a sheep now. No, you're a cow, actually.
It's awful. This is a bad idea. And what's that? 259, close enough. All right, so that's, actually, you know what? I'm gonna snap off the stick, don't need that. Apparently I'm not, I'm gonna strip it. Oh, maybe I should be stripping the needles instead of having the branches in. Okay, well I can do a bit more needle now. Where's a green one? That's a nice green one, okay. And 250. Nice. That is for the mash. I'll collect some more up for the boil. And now we can go throw in some grains. We're ready. All right, so we're mashing in with the 14 kilos of Pilsner malt. Now here's where things start to get interesting with the traditional Norwegian farmhouse beers. The mash could take anywhere between like 3 to 6 hours, which seems insane to me, but I suppose back then they were using extremely under-modified malts. They weren't like the brewers' grains that we have today that are really, really great at converting themselves and are packed full of enzymes. So it kind of makes sense that it took them a lot longer to actually get their conversions to make their beers. There's no benefit to us using modern day malt to actually doing a 3-hour mash. It's not going to achieve anything that wasn't achieved in the first hour. So I'm just going to go ahead and throw it all in. Now, sources differ on what temperature they mashed in at because they had no way of recording temperature. So they would typically boil a bunch of water to boiling point and then top it off with more water to cool it down or add the pine needles and all that kind of stuff in. And then they would kind of have their like rule of thumb to figure out, this is hot enough, now I'm going to throw my grains in. Again, that means that it's quite difficult for us to kind of figure out where it is, but from what I could tell, mashing in anywhere between like 66 to 69 was kind of where it started, often on the higher end, and they'd start throwing grains in and obviously it would cool down through thermal mass. So long and short of it is, I'm going to mash in at 67 degrees Celsius and hold that for 1 hour. So I'm going to start getting grain in and then we'll start working with the pine needles. Ooh yeah, and as always, throw some grain in, give it a good blitz. Paint mixer makes a real good job of that. 10 things that every home brewer should own, video card up there. Isn't that just so much easier than using a mash paddle? Oh man, we're going traditional. I probably should be using the mash paddle today. I should use the stick. I should use the stick to mash in. I should use the pine tree luge. By the way, this is 50 liters of strike water, that in Imperial Freedom units, and there's going to be another 30 liters of sparge water at the end of this for 80 liters total. By the way, the reason I'm using so much water for this recipe is because we're going to do a 4-hour boil. That is the other very traditional part with these beers. They did extremely long boils, anywhere between 3 to 6 hours. I'm going to go on the slightly shorter side and go 4 hours because it's just a lot of time to be boiling wort. And the idea behind that was the longer they boiled it, you'd start to get Maillard reactions and create melanoidins and kind of get a little bit of crystallization and caramelization of the sugars in the wort. So it's kind of like decoction mashing, but not quite. Similar, it's like a cousin to decoction mashing. So it'd build extra complexity by doing an extra long boil. Oh, so that means that obviously I need more liquid because I'm going to boil off a lot of water. I forgot to say that. Next part of traditional Norwegian brewing, mash hops. Now, if you go old school enough, way back to the Viking era, sources differ on whether or not hops were actually available in that region of the world. Some say yes, some say no, some say it was just using the trees and the spruces and spices and juniper and all that kind of stuff. I want this beer to still taste like beer, so I am going to use hops, and I'm using the more older varieties of hops that I have access to, so in this case East Kent Goldings, and they did do hops in their mash for Norwegian farmhouse ales, probably more on the modern side, like several hundred years ago rather than like 1,000. But hops did go in the mash. I'm going to throw in 70 grams, which is 2.5 ounces of East Kent Goldings into it. And I'm not sure what this is going to provide us, but based on the results of the Thiolized NEPA, thumb card up there, mash hopping does definitely have an impact on creating more fruity expression in the final product. I don't know how much hop oil and stuff is all in this, but we'll find out. And because we're going traditional, I'm not going to use a hop sock or a hop bag or anything like that, because that feels like cheating. They didn't have access to it, so neither should I. He says whilst using brand new stainless steel. All right, there's the hops. Now I need to start throwing in the pine needles. So I'm just gonna like, whoop, that didn't work. Let's get it a little bit in at a time. I'll kind of give it a big stir, push it all down in, and then I think we're cooking with gas. All right. And now there's no turning back. the needles are in. I still kind of question if that's enough needles, honestly. So hard to know. Well, look, I guess we can always add more in the boil. If we add too much now, then the whole thing's skunked. It does feel like they used more than this, though. Should we add more?
I don't know. How are you feeling? Confident?
Not really.
You're passing it through the tree, so I don't think so.
As in no more?
No, no more.
Okay, yeah. We'll let the tree do the rest of the work. Okay. Now, that's all mashed in. Let's get rid of that. I'm going to throw on the top filter just to try and prevent those hops from creeping around and causing us problems as we get to the boiling stage. Because, ow, that's hot, that's very hot, ow, 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 ow. Because that hop debris right now at this stage of adding them is not going to add any bitterness because we're not getting isomerization. However, that hop debris, if it makes it through to the boil, is going to be a whole bunch of extra IBUs that I didn't account for. So it's really important that that stays in the grain bed. Let's hope that this works. Now, I need to figure out a way to clamp this down. So give me a second while I try and like MacGyver this together. Okay, so we have our luge cut in our tree trunk. Now the goal is I'm going to be making a closed loop. So I'm going to recirculate the wort through the top, get rid of that twig, through the top of the trunk. I'm going to clamp this tubing down into it to hold it in there. That's going to flow through the trunk, collecting all the sap and piney, resiny goodness, and then go back into the mash tun itself. Going to be interesting. There's going to be some spills, I already know it. Okay, we think we've MacGyvered our contraption. Now, I'm going to reduce the flow rate. Oh, that's so cool. We've got a leak. Son bitch. Where's that leaking from? Did I cut too deep? Okay.
Just put a bucket underneath.
I'll just have to periodically come and grab the leaking bit and throw it back in. But I think we're cooking with gas. I think we're good. Look at it go.
Wow.
We've got a tree luge.
That is so cool.
Valhalla. I am a Viking now. Odin's son. Oh, Odin, you should be brewing this video. You're the one with the Viking name. We need to flip. I'll do the camera work and you brew.
That's too much effort.
That is sick. That is sick. All right, so 1 hour of this recirculating at 67 degrees Celsius. Then we'll come back at the end, and by that time, we should have a beer full of piney, resiny. All right, I got it. Okay, water salts. Now this one was very tricky because obviously they would have been using a lot of spring water and natural open waters, so it would have had minerals in it. After all my research, I could not figure out what the go-to water salt profile would have been for the Vikings back in the day, particularly around like the Voss region of Norway, which is the kind of style that I'm trying to emulate here. So the closest thing I could actually find was a style in Denmark. So in the region of Vestenberg. I'm so sorry to all you Norwegians. I'm trying very hard. This is not easy for my tongue. So in that style, what we're going to end up with for our profile is 61 parts per million of calcium, 9 parts per million magnesium, 20 sodium, 51 chloride, 44 sulfate, and 155 bicarbonate. That's what we've thrown in. I don't know if that is historically accurate or not, but it's accurate to Denmark, which is quite close to Norway. So it's my best guesstimate for what I can do for this particular beer today. All right, it is now the end of the hour. We can finally stop this recirculation, and the last of the wort has come through the trunk. I need to find something to do with this. I don't want to throw it away now. I've grown attached to my stick. So I am going to hoist this thing up because I am not lifting this. It is way too heavy. I'm going to get the winch out, and then we're going to start fly sparging. Now we're ready to winch this up. So this allows me to use minimal manpower and get the old ladder out so I can yank this up without actually snapping my back in half. All right, so our sparge water is 30 liters, as I mentioned earlier. It's sitting up around 80 degrees Celsius. And I've already added its phosphoric acid, which is about 4.7 mils, and all of its water salts, which is all in the recipe in the link down below. What we're going to do now is just jug by jug, pour it over the top of the grain bed, let it all drain through, and thereby get that extra sugar that's trapped in all the grains right now before we move on to our boiling step. So now just a bit of rinse and repeat, and at the end of this, we'll see you when this stuff is ready to start bubbling away. We are now at boiling. So I'm sorry, I'm gonna leave this on for a little bit because that is actually still dripping out a bit more. And considering that we have a 4-hour boil on our hands, I'm in no rush to actually remove the grains and you know, clean that out. So I'm gonna let it drip out for maybe like the next half an hour while this boils away. And in 3 hours from now, we're gonna come back and add our 1 hour addition of hops, which is once again gonna be 2 ounces, 2 ounces of East Kent Goldings. By the way, the reason that I chose the hops that I chose, and I'll talk about it as we get to the aroma and flavor hops as well, is I'm trying to use the oldest varietals or cousins of old varietals for this beer because they would have been related to noble hops when they were used many, many, many years ago. So my best guesstimate is to use European styles and UK styles of hops that odds are originated from original varieties back, you know, like 1,000 years ago and stuff. So East Kent Goldings, and the other one I'm using is Fuggles, both very old varieties of hop, very traditional flavors in a beer. I'm gonna use them because that's, in my best guesstimate, what I can approximate to what they might have had access to way, way back in the day. Now for your weird Viking beer fact of the day. There was a king called King Hakonen the Good back in the 10th century, where between his rule from 934 to 961 was trying to make a push for Christianity in Norway and in the regions of what is like the Nordic regions of the world. As Christianity was being pushed, one of his strategies to make the effort to convert everybody was to enforce a Christian mashup celebration and enforce celebration of Christmas with beer. So those who were estate holders and farmers and those who owned land were forced by law to make a Christmas beer, Spruce beer, every year. If you didn't, you could be issued a fine, and some sources say that in the extreme cases, if you didn't brew a beer 3 years in a row, you could be incarcerated, which is just madness. But obviously it worked, because then eventually, you know, the rest of Norway and the Nordic regions all became Christian, and they left their pagan ways. So maybe it was the push for beer that moved them into Christianity.
Hey, that's what started civilization, bro. Beer.
Beer makes everything go forwards. It makes the world go round.
Beer and bread.
Beer and bread. Just come and look at the coloring of this beer. This is the levels of caramelization and Maillard reactions in process. This was so much more pale when we started this extended boil, and now it's turning into this like almost burnt orange kind of color, which is absolutely awesome. And speaking of color, we do have a bunch of new awesome shirts available in our store, like this one right here, which is all about beer, banter, and bloody good times. So if you're into brewing, go get yourself one of these, help support the channel so we can keep making ridiculous videos just like this, or hit our Patreon in the link down below. And if you're not into that, that's totally cool. It is absolutely free to subscribe. So if you haven't done so already, subscribe to the channel, share it around, and help us spread the word of beer, banter, and bloody good times. And it is now time to add our 1 hour addition of hops. So that is going to be 58 grams / 2 ounces of East Kent Goldings. And that's going to give us an amount of IBUs. I can't remember. It'll be up there. I think it's going to give us around 20 IBUs or something to that effect. Let's just go ahead and throw them into the hop spider, I suppose. And we have boiled down a lot of liquid by this point. There's a lot of vapor coming off this throughout the day, and the color change on this beer is just absolutely phenomenal. Now, start your clocks. I'm gonna come back at the end of the hour, and with 10 minutes left to go, we're gonna add our final round of flavor and aroma hops before we get ready to start cooling this thing down. Oh, along with all the pine needles. So we're gonna go 10 minutes, flavor and aroma hops, all the pine needles, then flame out for yeast pitching. It is now 10 minutes left in the boil and time to add our final hop addition, which is going to be that 70 grams, 2.5 ounces each of East Kent Goldings and Fuggles. So that's going to give us some resininess, some pininess, some spiciness, some earthiness, and a little bit of herbal quality. You know, really old school, like noble hop flavorful varieties. Let's chuck them. Almost went out of the hop spider. Let's pop them in the hop spider. And it is time to add our, get in there, last few pine needles. That hop won't make it in. I ended up deciding to double it because we didn't really have a whole lot of pine or resiny quality coming through earlier. So we are going to go with 400 grams of pine needles into the boil. And Now it's gonna smell like Christmas. Oh, instantly in the air. That's wild. All right, I'm gonna get a stick and shove all this down. Actually, I got the perfect stick for the job. It's a multi-purpose luge now. All right, 10 minutes left, and then we'll get this thing down to yeast pitching temperature. There we go. Wow, you can smell that pine needle. Smells dank. Oh, probably worth talking about the difference between spruce and pine, because I was meant to mention it earlier, but traditionally the spruce beers are made with a spruce infusion, like a juniper tea. So what they'll do is they'll grab all the branches, throw them into a boil for a while and make a tea out of it, and then that tea juniper branch spruce water is what they'll then use to make the actual strike water for the start of the brew day. So it's actually starting with a spruce tea. Obviously we didn't do that today because we're working with pine and it's all slightly different, but a little bit of learning that I learned and now passing on to you because I'm never going to use that knowledge ever again. Shove the hops down. I think I'll turn this into a mash paddle. Organic. It's organic. The color is leaching out of those pine needles very quickly, so we're definitely extracting something. All right, when this is done, we'll come back. And we are now cooling our wort down. So that is the full 4 hours of boil done. That was a very, very long day. And now it's looking like we're at about 49 liters of wort. I'm gonna go get my refractometer and get a reading for us because I'm very curious about how much 4 hours of boiling can raise your original starting gravity. But the pine needle smell is definitely way up in the air. It smells awesome. I'm gonna get a glass as well because this color has changed so much over the course of this boil. So let me go grab those and then I'll come back. There it is. That color is like a kind of like a deep burnt orange. It looks so good. It looks so good. It looks just like the photos of the Norwegian farmhouse ales that I've seen online doing the research for this. So that 4 hours of boil at the very minimum has given us the color that we're after, and I dare say it's going to give us more complexity in terms of like the caramelization and the flavors that we're going to pull out of this thing, because so much of the flavor of this beer is coming from the process of how you use the malts and the yeast, the Kveik yeast itself, because there's so little hops in this in comparison to what we're actually doing here. But it's all about the yeast expression, those long boils, long mash times, and the pine tree. All right, let's see what we're working with. Let it cool down. All right, whoops. We are at 1.076, 1.077, 1.077, okay. When that ferments down, and it should ferment out pretty low because this is all Pilsner malt, I reckon we end up with around 9% or close enough to it. I'll do some quick maths off camera, but that's kind of the ballpark I was aiming for. I wanted this to be boozy because the side kicker of this is I want to throw half of this into a barrel because beers were stored in barrels back in the day. It's what they were invented for. So I'm very curious to see what the farmhouse will turn into after sitting in a barrel for like 6 months to a year. I think we'll make it a very, very special beer for next year's Christmas. In any case, we'll cool this down and then we'll transfer to the fermenter. We are ready to transfer, and we're transferring warm because this is a Norwegian farmhouse ale, which means I need to be using Norwegian yeast. And the yeast in question that I'm going to be using is Kveik, of course. In this particular case, I'm going to be using Kveik Voss strain. So I want to ferment this very warm. I'm going to ferment it up around 35 degrees Celsius, hold it through there, and I'm going to also do it with an open ferment for the first couple of days. Now I know that Kveik ferments extremely fast, so I expect to hit final gravity probably in like 3 or 4 days. It's going to blow straight through it. So I'm going to do the first 2 days open ferment, and what I mean by open ferment is I'm going to have the top of this open with just like a covering sitting on top so no bugs or anything get in. But the whole idea behind that is you get more yeast expression if you've got absolutely zero pressure going on inside. By having it open, it means that it's going to be at atmospheric pressure, because even if you use just an airlock with a little bubbler, that's still building up a level of pressure inside the fermenter. And we've got pretty good reason to believe that a lot of these old styles of beer that were made many hundreds of years ago were probably done with open fermentation. So I'm going to be doing the same. That is also going to give us a little bit more fruity, tropical flavors and aromas, a bit more orange zest kind of expression coming out of the yeast itself. Now, once that is finished transferring over, we'll throw the Voskevike yeast in, and then we sit back and wait. Last shot of the day, the Voskevike yeast. I'm using 4 packets. Probably a little bit of overkill, but 2 of these packets are technically expired, so a little bit of an overpitch never hurt anyone, especially considering how boozy this particular beer is going to be. And let's pour them all in. Could have done a yeast starter, didn't do a yeast starter. It's fine. Well, realistically, they didn't do yeast starters either. Well, I mean, they kind of did. So you know there's like the rings, like the wooden rings that looks kind of like a crown of thorns type thing. They would put that into the fermenter so that when it hit high Krausen, they would then take that wooden ring out and let it dry out in the sun. And then that ring with all like the gunk and the creaminess on it is all the yeast. So then they could use that for the next time that they needed to make a beer. And that's how these farmhouse Kvike strains of yeast still survive to this day. It's from those brewing practices and traditions that have existed for just centuries, which is pretty cool. So we get to brew with a little bit of history here because of the brewing traditions of the peoples of that land. Now, I am going to pop this on top, and I'm going to pop a little cover on top of this and just kind of rest it loosely on this. Like I'll kind of have it like that. I'll figure out a way to do this so that I've basically got this covered, but I'm not increasing the pressure inside the tank, if that makes sense. Anyway, this has got no dry hopping or anything actually, so the next time you guys see me is when I'm gonna be pouring a fresh pint of the Viking tree beer. And here is the final result. Now, first things first, I've got to say that the color on this beer is just so awesome. I don't know how much of it gets captured on camera, but it has a beautiful, almost orangish kind of hue, like a golden copper orange type thing, as opposed to just being blonde, which is so cool. The head sticks around for absolute days. It's super creamy and fluffy and just has so much structure to it. Kind of like a big fluffy cloud that just sits there floating on top, and it lasts for ages. But the aroma and the smell are mind-boggling. Like, it's so bizarre to me how much I'm getting Nipa vibes off this. I have to imagine that is the Kvike yeast pulling a massive amount of weight there, bringing this thing together and pumping out tons of esters and phenols. Like, there's heaps of orange and citrus and pineapple and mango type flavors and aromas that are popping out of the nose. And on the palate, first thing I get is, again, that same thing. It's really fresh and vibrant and zesty, like heaps of orange, heaps of mango. There's like, is it like guava? I think there's a bit of a guava thing going on there. And then the whole beer changes and becomes incredibly complex after that initial taste. It goes from being all about this fresh tropical fruit thing, which I have to imagine must be the Kvike yeast at play, and potentially that mash hop that we did, because as we've learned recently from the thiolized Nipa, mash hops really help you get that boost of unbound thiols that just give you that huge pop of fresh fruit. But after all of that, it becomes very layered. It starts off with this like dankness and this resininess, which I must imagine is the pine needles and the pine tree itself at work. I have to believe, and that, and with the hops we chose, those East Kent Goldings, can have levels of, resininess to them, which is why I chose them for this beer, amongst other reasons. But it's like this deep, sweet dankness, not the type of resiny pine that I'm used to getting from like an IPA that leans into that, but more of a real tasting resin, if that makes sense. Like almost like the sap of the pine tree itself, even though I know sap actually doesn't taste that nice, but that's what I imagine it tastes like. And then it finishes surprisingly sweet. And again, not the kind of sweetness that's just like sugar or just regular crystal. It's that sweetness that I know distinctly tastes so similar to our Marzen that we brewed for Oktoberfest. Link to that video up there if you want to see that. But that particular beer had that deep, burnt caramel type sweetness that's not quite caramel, not quite candy, but it's that melanoidin effect that you get in there that creates this really rich sweetness that's not cloying and not overpowering in the way that regular sweetness is, but it's more layered and nuanced than that, which is very, very cool. So that's thanks to that 4-hour boil. It absolutely has to be. There's nowhere else that level of sweetness is coming from, because there was only one malt in here and it was all Pilsner malt. So I didn't get the level of pine that I was expecting from this. I thought there was going to be a lot more fresh pine flavor and aroma, and I was worried about overpowering it and doing too much pine and with the needles and everything. But what I think has happened through biotransformation is all that pine flavor that might have been there at one point was transformed into this sweet resin-like character, and potentially even transformed into a bit of a fresh citrus, like pine citrus type flavor and aroma. Because there's that, it's that citrus that's layered in here that's not regular like lemon zest or orange zest, or like not just orange zest or lime zest. It's like a piney zest is the best way that I can describe it. It's honestly one of the most complex beers I've ever tasted myself. It's very, very layered, and I can sit here crapping on for ages about all the different flavors and aromas I'm pulling out of this thing. But this is running a little long. So if you want to see a full tasting for this one and some of the other beers that we've done recently on the channel, all that's going to be dropping very likely in the new year. So until then, guys, I hope you have a very, very Merry Christmas with friends and family. And we'll catch you next week for the final video of 2024. So cheers. See you next time.